Harlem, New York. 2:17 a.m. Saturday, September 14th, 1963. The late summer heat clung to the asphalt of 125th Street like a fever that wouldn't break. Steam rose from manholes, carrying the stench of garbage and broken dreams through the humid air. Inside the Red Rooster Club, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic taste of fear. The jukebox in the corner played Miles Davis, but the trumpet's cry couldn't mask the tension that had settled over the room like a burial shroud. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in the back booth, motionless as carved stone. His charcoal suit was pressed to perfection, his tie knotted with military precision. At 56, his hands showed the scars of 3 decades in Harlem's underworld, but they rested calmly on the table beside an untouched glass of bourbon. He wasn't drinking. He was listening. He was calculating. He was preparing to enforce a promise that had kept his neighborhood clean for 12 years. Across from him sat the mistake that would define the next 72 hours. Vincent "Vinny" Baggs Torino, 29 years old, Genovese family soldier, wearing a silk shirt that cost more than most families on this block, made in a month. His cologne couldn't mask the smell of heroin residue on his fingers or the arrogance that had brought him into Bumpy's territory uninvited. This was the man who had spent the last 6 weeks flooding 135th Street with white powder, turning corner boys into zombies and mothers into mourners. At 2:19 a.m., the club door opened. A gust of humid air carried in the distant sound of sirens and the echo of footsteps on wet pavement. The bartender glanced toward the back booth, then quickly looked away. The 3 couples dancing near the jukebox moved closer together, instinctively sensing the atmospheric pressure drop that preceded violence. Vinny leaned forward, his voice a whisper that carried the confidence of a man who believed his Italian connections made him untouchable. "Look, Bumpy, I respect what you built here, but times change. The old rules don't apply. My people move product through every neighborhood in the city. Harlem ain't special." He paused, smiled, and made the fatal error of reaching across the table to tap Bumpy's hand with one finger. "You had a good run playing protector, but protection don't pay like poison does. You want to keep eating? You take your cut and look the other way. Simple business." The temperature in the Red Rooster seemed to drop 20 degrees. The Miles Davis record skipped once, then continued playing. At the bar, 2 off-duty cops suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The dancing couple stopped moving entirely. Bumpy didn't pull his hand away. He didn't blink. He studied the spot where Vinny's finger had touched his skin, then raised his eyes to meet the younger man's gaze. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You have 48 hours to remove yourself and your product from my neighborhood. Every bag, every corner, every runner. 48 hours. Vinny laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the humid air. "Then if I don't, you gonna call the cops? Start a war with the Genovese family?" "Face facts, old man. You don't have the juice to back up threats anymore." At 2:22 a.m., Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a white handkerchief. He wiped the spot on his hand where Vinny had touched him, slowly, methodically, as if cleaning away contamination. He placed the soiled cloth on the table between them. 48 hours, he repeated. "After that, I return you to your family in pieces they can bury." Vinny stood, straightened his silk shirt, and made his final mistake. He picked up Bumpy's untouched bourbon and drained it in one gulp. "Your neighborhood's already poisoned, old man. Kids are buying from me instead of playing stickball. Mothers are choosing my product over their rent money. Your promise is already broken. You just don't know it yet." He walked out into the humid night, believing his Italian connections made him immortal. He was wrong. The systematic dismantling of Vincent Torino wasn't just about punishment. It was about sending a message written in blood to every crime family in New York City. The man who had kept heroin out of Harlem for 12 years was about to demonstrate why promises, once made, must be kept at any cost. 72 hours later, Vinny's body would be found in a Bronx warehouse, arranged in a way designed not just to kill him, but to humiliate every supplier who thought Harlem was for sale. The story of how Vincent Torino lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to 1951, when the promise was first made. February 17th, 1951, 3:47 a.m., Harlem Hospital, room 304. The fluorescent lights hummed with mechanical indifference above the narrow bed where Stephanie St. Clair was drowning from the inside. Pneumonia had turned her lungs into flooded chambers, each breath a wet rattle that echoed off pale green walls. At 54, the queen of numbers weighed less than 100 pounds, her skin stretched translucent over bones that seemed ready to pierce through. But her grip on Bumpy Johnson's wrist possessed the strength of a woman refusing to leave this world without settling her final account. For 12 years, their partnership had functioned as Harlem's immune system. The numbers racket they controlled wasn't exploitation, it was protection. While downtown bankers redlined black families into slums, Bumpy and Stephanie turned illegal gambling into community credit. A woman could cover rent with a 3-cent hit. A grocer could restock after a bad week. The money circulated within the neighborhood, not out of it. Stephanie's philosophy was carved into every operation they ran. We take their gambling money, never their hope. The distinction mattered. A man could lose $1 on numbers and still feed his family. A man who lost that dollar to heroin lost everything that made him human. The Italian mob had tested this boundary in 1950. The Genovese family saw Harlem as virgin territory for heroin distribution, a neighborhood full of desperate customers and corrupt cops who could be bought for pocket change. They sent 4 suppliers into the territory with enough white powder to turn every block into a graveyard. Bumpy's response had been surgical and unambiguous. All 4 men were found floating in the Hudson River within a week, their bodies weighted with chains but positioned to be discovered. The message wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. The Italians retreated, but no one believed they were finished. Heroin profits made numbers' money look like pocket change. Now, 14 months later, Stephanie's ice-cold fingers tightened on Bumpy's wrist with sudden urgency. Her eyes, yellowed by organ failure, locked onto his with the clarity of absolute certainty. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but every word carried the weight of prophecy. When they come back with poison, you drown them all. It wasn't a request. It wasn't advice. It was a deathbed ultimatum from the woman who had made him into the most feared man in Harlem. 3 of his lieutenants stood against the far wall, witnessing the transfer of power. Marcus, Jerome, and William, men who had killed for this organization and would kill again. They heard what came next. They understood its implications. Bumpy leaned closer, his face inches from hers, and spoke the words she needed to hear before she could let go. No drugs in my neighborhood. At 4:23 a.m., Stephanie St. Clair exhaled one final wet breath and went still. The fluorescent lights continued their indifferent humming. Bumpy didn't move. He sat beside her body for 2 hours in complete silence, his hand still held in her death grip, calculating the cost of the promise he had just made. At 6:34 a.m., he finally stood and walked out of room 304, through the hospital corridor and into the brittle morning light. A black Cadillac with Italian plates sat parked across from the hospital entrance. 3 men waited inside, their faces visible through the windshield. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. The driver's window rolled down slowly. The man behind the wheel nodded once at Bumpy. Not respect, just recognition. The war Stephanie had predicted with her dying breath had already begun. June 1951 arrived with the Genovese family's systematic testing of Bumpy Johnson's resolve. Heroin shipments flooded into Harlem through 6 different channels, each route calculated to overwhelm his capacity for response. The strategy was standard mob mathematics, force him to choose between protecting one block while 3 others fell, exhaust his resources, prove his promise was nothing but theatrical posturing. They expected him to intercept drugs, chase product, waste energy on an unwinnable war of attrition. They miscalculated completely. Bumpy ignored the heroin entirely and targeted the men who distributed it with surgical precision that turned economics into anatomy lessons. His counter-strategy was cold, mathematical, and brutal. Intercepting shipments meant touching the product, entering the trade by the back door. He had given his word, no drugs in his neighborhood. That oath wasn't just about supply, it was about identity. So he ignored the cargo and went after the breathing mechanisms that distributed poison to his people. No wasted motion, no public speeches, just quiet erasure. Antonio Esposito, known as Tony Bags for the paper sacks of powder he carried, made the fatal error of conducting business outside St. Philip's Church on a Thursday afternoon. 3 high school students, none older than 16, handed him crumpled dollar bills in exchange for glassine envelopes. Bumpy's surveillance team documented the transaction from across the street. 47 hours later, Tony was found in the trunk of his own Buick, parked outside a Bronx social club. He had drowned in exactly 6 inches of stagnant water, his face submerged in a metal basin, hands tied behind his back in a position that forced him to watch his own death coming for 20 agonizing minutes. The water level wasn't accidental. It was deliberate positioning for slow suffocation, a death that required consciousness and terror. In Tony's jacket pocket, folded with funeral precision, was a white card with a single word written in black ink, 1. The second and third targets were eliminated within 72 hours. Salvatore Russo, found hanging from a fire escape on 125th Street, swaying in the morning breeze like a grim pendulum, card reading 2. Michael Calabrese, discovered stuffed into a basement coal chute, his legs broken to fit the narrow opening, card reading 3. The sequential numbering wasn't just record-keeping, it was psychological warfare. Every Genovese soldier in New York understood the implication. This wasn't random violence. It was a systematic countdown to their own deaths. The 4th target represented escalation. Johnny Torino was a made man, a Genovese capo with 20 years of family protection and blood connections that supposedly made him untouchable. He disappeared on a Tuesday evening after leaving his mistress's apartment in the Bronx. No body was ever recovered. No card was ever found. The complete absence of evidence was more terrifying than any corpse could have been. Johnny Torino simply ceased to exist, erased from reality so thoroughly that even his family stopped asking questions after the first week. Bumpy's message reached the Genovese leadership through Captain Michael Donnelly, a nip detective whose mortgage payments came from mob envelopes. The words were delivered verbatim. Harlem is closed to your business. The Italian mob conducted their own cost-benefit analysis. 4 dead soldiers, 1 missing capo, and a neighborhood generating maybe $50,000 monthly in potential heroin profits. They redirected operations to the Bronx and Brooklyn, territories where local power structures could be purchased rather than fought. The community response solidified Bumpy's reputation as the man who kept his word. Reverends praised him from pulpits. Mothers stopped him on street corners to shake his hand. Store owners displayed his photograph beside pictures of Marcus Garvey. At a victory celebration in the Red Rooster Club, surrounded by his lieutenants, Marcus raised his glass and asked the question that would haunt the next 12 years. What happens when someone inside the family gets greedy? The music continued, conversations flowed, but Bumpy's response was 11 seconds of absolute silence, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression that communicated more than words ever could. The question was never asked again, but doubt had been planted in soil that would eventually yield a poisonous harvest. 1951 through 1963 represented Harlem's golden years under Bumpy Johnson's systematic protection. a period when illegal gambling functioned as the neighborhood's unofficial treasury. The numbers racket generated $50,000 weekly, equivalent to $500,000 in modern purchasing power. But unlike the Italian operations downtown, every dollar was treated as community investment rather than personal enrichment. Bumpy funded elementary schools when city budgets abandoned black children to crumbling classrooms. He kept St. Philip's Church operational when the archdiocese threatened closure over unpaid bills. Small businesses received interest-free loans that legitimate banks would never approve for black entrepreneurs. This wasn't charity. It was the construction of legitimate power through illegitimate means, building a foundation that couldn't be destroyed by a single arrest or assassination. His public image crystallized into neighborhood mythology. The Robin Hood of Harlem, the protector against outside exploitation, the man who kept his word when politicians and preachers broke theirs daily. Mothers taught children his name as a synonym for justice. Store owners displayed his photograph beside pictures of Marcus Garvey. But beneath this carefully maintained reputation, mathematics was quietly eroding the foundation of everything he had built. Heroin profits in surrounding neighborhoods were 400% higher than numbers money. The Bronx, Brooklyn, and Lower Manhattan were generating millions monthly, while Bumpy's operation maxed out at 200,000. His younger soldiers began doing arithmetic that sounded like economic analysis, but functioned as moral challenges. They watched Italian associates drive Cadillacs bought with powder money, while they drove Chevrolets bought with nickels and dimes. Why protect a neighborhood that could make them rich if they just opened the gates? The whispers started in back rooms and pool halls. Bumpy is old. Bumpy is stubborn. Bumpy is leaving money on the table. Internal pressure mounted as street legends traveled north faster than the drugs themselves. Younger soldiers heard stories of crews pushing powder, who cleared returns that made numbers money look like pocket change. Principle, they decided, was a luxury enjoyed by men who already had full pockets and established territory. The questions multiplied in private conversations, spreading like infection through an organization built on loyalty that was increasingly expensive to maintain. 1962 brought the crisis directly into Bumpy's bloodline. His nephew, Marcus Johnson, was arrested on 135th Street with 3 ounces of pure heroin in his jacket pocket. During precinct interrogation, Marcus claimed independence, swearing he was freelancing without organizational support, insisting he had no family connections to the business. Bumpy read the police report and knew instantly it was a lie. 3 ounces required a supplier, a distribution network, and protection. No freelancer moved that kind of weight without approval from established power. Marcus was 23 years old, functionally illiterate, and incapable of establishing independent supply chains. The investigation took 3 months of patient surveillance. Bumpy didn't use police contacts or official channels. He used the street network he had spent decades building. The same watchers who had documented Tony Baggs selling to high school students outside the church. The discovery was devastating. 5 of his own soldiers had been running product for 7 months, moving heroin through Harlem with the precision that only insider knowledge could provide. They knew the patrol schedules, the safe houses, the corrupt cops who could be paid to look away. Combined monthly profits exceeded $80,000, money that never touched the organization's books. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was existential. These men had watched him drown Tony Baggs in 6 inches of water for selling to children. Now they were doing the same thing, calculating that blood relationships and organizational loyalty would protect them from consequences. Bumpy faced an impossible choice that would define the next phase of his rule. Expose the betrayal publicly and admit weakness that would invite challenges from every direction, or eliminate family members without explanation and risk mutiny from the younger generation who already doubted his leadership. Either path destroyed something essential about the organization he had built on the foundation of Stephanie St. Clair's deathbed ultimatum. Calculation won over sentiment. Rather than move immediately to execution, Bumpy chose a third option that required more courage than violence. He would offer them one chance at redemption, a single opportunity to choose the family over the powder. It was a gamble that went against every instinct he possessed, but he needed to know if the rot was isolated or systemic. February 1963, a warehouse on the West Side Highway, cold enough to see breath, hang in the air like ghosts. The meeting was set for midnight. The 5 traders arrived together, their coats bulging with concealed weapons, expecting negotiation about percentages and territory, confident that Bumpy's legendary restraint would create room for compromise. They thought they were coming to dictate terms to an old man whose time had passed. Bumpy arrived at 12:01 with only 2 men, Jerome and William, and an ultimatum that would test everything he had built over 12 years. The warehouse door slid shut, locking them all inside with a choice that only one side would survive. The warehouse confrontation began at 12:03 a.m., with Raymond Johnson stepping forward from the group of 5, his confidence bolstered by the concealed pistol pressing against his ribs, and 31 years of believing blood relationships created immunity from consequences. Bumpy's cousin carried himself with the entitlement of a man who had run heroin operations for 7 months without detection, sharp enough to avoid capture, but stupid enough to think he could justify betrayal face to face with the most dangerous man in Harlem. Raymond's opening argument was pure street economics wrapped in community concern. Kids are buying anyway, he insisted. Demand exists independent of supply. Prohibition never stopped anything in human history. They walk 3 blocks south or take the train to the Bronx, spending money that leaves the neighborhood entirely. We don't sell it. Someone else will. At least this way we keep the money in Harlem instead of watching Italians extract wealth from their community like colonial powers mining Africa for diamonds. The logic was seductive because it contained fragments of truth, suggesting that controlling poison was more realistic than preventing it. Bumpy listened without interruption, his expression carved from stone, letting Raymond finish his complete pitch before responding with words that cut through economic justification like a scalpel through infected tissue. The promise wasn't about economics, it was about identity and protection. Numbers gambling took money, but left dignity intact. A man could lose $1 on a bet and still look his children in the eye. Heroin took everything that made a person human and replaced it with needs so desperate that mothers sold their bodies and fathers abandoned their families. Raymond's logic turned Harlem into a business opportunity instead of a neighborhood worth protecting. That wasn't business, it was cannibalism. The negotiation lasted 17 minutes. Bumpy offered them 48 hours to dissolve operations completely, return every stolen dollar, and submit to reduced roles with permanent surveillance. No drowning in car trunks, no bodies stuffed into coal chutes. Just demotion and shame in exchange for continued breathing. Raymond agreed immediately, his voice steady, his handshake firm, his eyes meeting Bumpy's with apparent relief. But Bumpy recognized the lie instantly. Raymond's pupils dilated slightly. His left hand touched his jacket pocket twice, checking for weapons. His breathing pattern changed from anxious to calculated. These weren't the physical markers of a man accepting mercy. They were preparations for elimination. Strategic patience replaced immediate violence. Instead of executing them in the warehouse, Bumpy let them believe they had won, that age had softened him into negotiation instead of annihilation. For 3 months, his surveillance network turned inward with devastating results. 6 more soldiers revealed themselves as potential traitors, their conversations recorded discussing Bumpy's elimination with casual indifference. The rot wasn't isolated. It was systemic, a generational divide spreading through the organization like gangrene. The community paid the price for this internal Cold War. Heroin use in Harlem increased 40% between March and June. Overdose deaths tripled. Emergency rooms filled with teenagers whose parents had trusted Bumpy's promise of protection. Reverend James confronted him publicly on church steps, his accusation carrying across the street. "Where is the man who protected us? Our children are dying while you settle scores with your own soldiers." The philosophical crisis that followed kept Bumpy awake for 72 consecutive hours. If he couldn't stop the heroin, should he control it instead? The questions felt like betrayal of everything Stephanie had demanded, but they also felt like the only realistic path forward. September 1963 arrived with the ultimate test. Bumpy made contact with Vincent Torino, Raymond's new Italian supplier. Instead of eliminating him immediately, instead of drowning him like Tony Baggs, Bumpy arranged a meeting. The promise he had kept for 12 years was about to face its ultimate temptation, not from outside forces, but from the mathematics of survival itself. September 14th, 1963, 2:17 a.m., the Red Rooster Club confrontation carries devastating weight when viewed with complete context. Vincent Torino's arrogance wasn't youthful recklessness or simple territorial ambition. It was a deliberate instrument, carefully crafted by Genovese strategists to test the structural integrity of a promise that had protected Harlem for 12 years. His calculated insults, the contemptuous tap on Bumpy's hand, the dismissal of neighborhood sanctity, every gesture functioned as psychological pressure applied to an aging structure, probing for cracks that would justify full-scale invasion. The 48-hour ultimatum wasn't mercy. It was Bumpy buying time to orchestrate a response that would echo through every crime family meeting for decades. 6:43 a.m. Saturday morning, Vincent delivered his answer with theatrical defiance. Distribution points opened on 135th Street with aggressive visibility. Runners conducting transactions in broad daylight outside the same church where Tony Baggs had died 12 years earlier. The message was unmistakable. Bumpy's threats were historical artifacts, irrelevant to modern economics. The systematic response demonstrated why underestimating Ellsworth Johnson remained a fatal miscalculation. Bumpy didn't strike immediately with the rage Vincent expected. For 8 hours, surveillance teams photographed every transaction, recorded every customer, mapped every movement of product through the neighborhood. This wasn't preparation for random violence. It was construction of an airtight case that would justify systematic elimination. 2:15 p.m., Saturday afternoon, Vincent's lead runner was found in a tenement stairwell on Lenox Avenue. His fingers had been broken with methodical precision, each digit snapped individually with a ball-peen hammer, designed to end his career handling product permanently. A note pinned to his chest with a sewing needle read, "First warning. The violence was surgical. Hands that distribute poison will no longer function." Vincent's escalation revealed the depth of his miscalculation. Rather than retreat, he targeted children of Bumpy's associates with free samples, calculating that attacking family would force negotiation. At 4:37 a.m. Sunday, 16-year-old Sarah Mitchell was found overdosed behind the Apollo Theater, foam crusting her lips, pupils fixed and dilated. She was Marcus's daughter, the same Marcus who had asked what happens when someone inside the family gets greedy. When Bumpy arrived at Harlem Hospital and saw Marcus sitting in the same waiting room where Stephanie had died, the philosophical crisis ended. Mathematics no longer mattered. 11:47 p.m. Sunday night, Bumpy personally led the raid on Vincent's stash house on 142nd Street. The operation demonstrated military precision acquired through 3 decades of systematic violence. 6 dealers were stripped naked and beaten with oranges wrapped in towels, a technique that causes massive internal trauma without leaving external marks that attract police attention. They were tied to lampposts throughout the neighborhood, with cardboard signs hung around their necks, "I poison children." The heroin destruction proved principle over profit with devastating finality. 3 kilos of pure heroin, worth millions on the street, were flushed down toilets while the dealers watched. Bumpy didn't steal a single ounce for resale. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a rival business operation competing for market share. It was a sanitation department cleaning up filth that threatened community survival. But Vincent wasn't at the stash house. At 12:33 a.m. Monday morning, a black rotary phone rang in the gutted building. Vincent's voice carried through the receiver, mocking and confident, accompanied by the background noise of silverware on china and family laughter. He was calling from a Genovese dinner in New Jersey, revealing the terrifying truth that transformed everything. He had explicit permission from the commission to eliminate the aging protector. The test was over. The execution order had been signed. The promise Bumpy made over Stephanie's deathbed was about to face its final, impossible challenge. Vincent Torino's fatal miscalculation was believing Italian protection functioned as absolute immunity rather than conditional business arrangement. He understood hierarchy, but completely misread economics. Protection is a cost-benefit calculation, not a blood oath, and business decisions change when expenses exceed projected returns. Bumpy Johnson grasped this mathematics with the precision of a man who had survived 30 years by understanding exactly when loyalty becomes liability. Asymmetric warfare began Monday morning with surgical strikes against Genovese's legitimate business infrastructure throughout Harlem. Jukeboxes in 23 bars were smashed with sledgehammers, their coin mechanisms destroyed beyond repair, forcing Italian distributors to absorb replacement costs while losing weekly revenue streams. Vending machines outside social clubs were overturned and gutted, their contents distributed to homeless veterans who understood the symbolic gesture. 3 garbage trucks servicing Italian-owned restaurants were torched before dawn, their drivers beaten with tire irons and warned that future employment in Harlem would result in permanent disability. This wasn't random vandalism. It was calculated economic warfare designed to make Vincent's heroin profits irrelevant compared to legitimate business losses. The psychological warfare transcended property destruction into territory that violated every diplomatic protocol of organized crime. Tuesday afternoon, Bumpy sent a velvet jewelry box to Genovese capo Anthony Strollo containing 6 severed fingers, each one removed from captured dealers with bolt cutters, preserved with surgical precision. The attached note was typed on plain paper. The needle breaks the skin. The hammer breaks the hand. The message communicated philosophy more than threat. Continue distributing poison and lose the physical capacity to conduct any business whatsoever. Community mobilization transformed individual resistance into coordinated economic siege. Harlem closed to Italian commerce with precision that resembled labor strikes. Deliveries were refused at loading docks by human chains of church deacons and grandmothers. Longshoremen stopped unloading trucks with Italian manifests. Construction sites blocked concrete deliveries. The economic pressure mounted systematically, turning Vincent from asset into catastrophic liability. Genovese accountants calculated losses exceeding 40,000 weekly, dwarfing heroin profits that were supposed to justify territorial expansion. The betrayal arrived through official channels with bureaucratic coldness. Anthony Strollo sent word that Vincent Torino no longer carried family protection, that his independent actions had violated protocols, that his continued existence was no longer a Genovese concern. The translation was unmistakable. Vincent was exposed, abandoned, available for elimination without consequence or retaliation. September 17th, 4:30 a.m., Vincent was found hiding in a New Jersey motel outside Newark, registered under a false name that fooled nobody. Bumpy went personally, not sending soldiers, because this wasn't organizational efficiency. It was honor and the fulfillment of specific promises made in specific words. Vincent begged with desperate creativity, offering $200,000 in hidden cash, names of corrupt judges, future loyalty that would have been worthless, even if sincere. Bumpy rejected everything with silence that communicated more than words ever could. The fulfillment of the specific threat made at the Red Rooster Club was surgical and literal. Vincent was returned to his family in pieces small enough for burial, dismantled with the same methodical precision he had used distributing heroin to Harlem children. The execution wasn't sadistic. It was contractual completion of terms agreed upon during their final conversation. September 18th, 9:15 a.m., a package was delivered to the Genovese Social Club on Mulberry Street. Inside was Vincent's signature gray fedora, blood-soaked but recognizable, accompanied by a handwritten note on expensive stationery, promise kept, debt settled. September 1963 through 1968 represented Bumpy Johnson's final descent, a systematic collapse of absolute principle under pressures that no amount of violence could permanently resolve. The execution of Vincent Torino had preserved the appearance of victory, but within months the limitation became devastatingly clear. Heroin found alternative routes into Harlem, with the inevitability of water flowing downhill, distributed through Puerto Rican crews, Cuban networks, and independent freelancers who operated outside traditional mob hierarchies. The promise had been built on controlling Italian supply, a strategy that became obsolete as the market evolved beyond ethnic boundaries. Internal erosion accelerated as maintaining the promise required increasingly brutal enforcement that alienated the community he claimed to protect. Former soldiers were executed for minor infractions. Teenagers suspected of dealing disappeared without evidence or trial. The man who had once functioned as Harlem's immune system became an autoimmune disorder, attacking healthy tissue in desperate attempts to eliminate infection that kept regenerating from sources he couldn't identify or control. The tragic irony that destroyed Bumpy's soul arrived through pure mathematics. Federal investigations generated legal defense costs exceeding $200,000 annually. Organizational survival demanded capital that numbers gambling could no longer provide. In 1966, facing bankruptcy and dissolution, Bumpy made the compromise that Stephanie St. Clair would have considered worse than death. He began taxing heroin distribution he could not eliminate. Controlled distribution became the systematic betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. Certain blocks were designated sacrifice zones where independent dealers could operate in exchange for tribute payments. The justification was regulation rather than participation, harm reduction rather than profit extraction. But the distinction was meaningless to mothers whose children died with needles in their arms. This wasn't protection, it was taxation of death, bureaucratic management of human ruin that mocked every promise made over Stephanie's deathbed. Community response shifted with brutal efficiency. Reverence transformed into disappointment, then quiet contempt. Parents who had once pointed to Bumpy as proof that someone powerful protected their children began crossing streets to avoid him. Store owners removed his photographs from walls, replacing them with images of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, men who had died for their principles rather than compromising them for survival. The protector had become just another profiteer extracting percentages from neighborhood misery. July 7th, 1968, 2:37 p.m., Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street. Bumpy Johnson collapsed face first into a plate of chicken, felled by massive heart attack at age 62. The organ that had carried Harlem's weight for 3 decades simply stopped, exhausted by the arithmetic of stress, age, and compromise that no constitution could indefinitely sustain. Death did not restore his standing. Only 17 people attended his funeral. Churches that had accepted his donations for decades refused to host the service, citing moral objections that hadn't existed when envelopes were full of cash. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, not Harlem. The neighborhood he had spent his life protecting no longer wanted him in its soil. Historical revision began immediately, transforming failure into sanitized legend. Movies and television shows would portray him as an uncompromising hero who never bent, never broke, never allowed poison into his territory. The buried truth was more complex and infinitely sadder. Even the strongest principles bend under sufficient pressure. Bumpy kept his promise for 12 years, longer than anyone thought possible. But promises made over deathbeds carry weight that eventually crushes the men who make them. The oath wasn't broken by outside forces. It was broken by the mathematics of survival. In the underworld, Even the most sacred promises have expiration dates written in blood and economics.